So I was asked a question about my workflow in the recording studio, and I wanted to come to you and pretty much cover that. Number one, if you walk into this studio, it's not like some laid, decked out looking, wow, this is incredible. It really is. I've always been a cosmetic last, sound quality first. There's a ton of bass traps in this room. So part of my workflow is understanding my room and spending countless hours moving bass traps and getting the right image. I don't like having to use a lot of room correction. I know there's been videos on that. I still use room correction to this day when it comes to my small speakers, but we actually have a pair of Bauer and Wilkins. They're the Matrix 801 limited edition. It's a long story. I went and drove to Chicago and met a guy on a whim. That was a long drive. Thank God I did, because when I got them back here, they're unbelievable. These are the same ones that Abbey Road Studio used for, I think, from the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and then they upgraded to the new ones. Now, if you see that Waves plug-in that they came out with, it's a very accurate representation of what my room sounds like. I'm not saying my room's Abbey Road's, but my room sounds very, very accurate. Right now I have a AC blowing in here because we're getting ready to install some mini splits, which are just going to be dead silent. Last year we had an overhead thing that was killing us, but you got to make do with what you have. But so number one, the room and the speakers are really well equipped for me, and I hear it really well. I hear the bass, and those speakers are unbelievable. Now I have another little set of speakers I just put in here. They're called the IK Multimedia iLouds. Those have become like a secondary. I have some Aventones, and those three speakers have worked well for me. I think nowadays we're listening to systems that really cater to that, like cater to that small, high fidelity, smaller system, like a Beats Pill or a Sonos system or a sound bar with a sub, or you're talking most car stereos like mine has a Bose system, which is really high fidelity. So there's a certain sound today's music and today's systems has inherited. So we have to be able to reference on something like that. So that's a big part of my workflow. But today I want to talk about signal flow. So as mixing has become a little bit different, when I first started early on in mastering, it was more about buying equipment that could just add a little bit more of that punch, or a little bit more of that depth, or a little bit more of that the image that was already there. So I was working with a lot of clients that were coming from these bigger boards and bigger mixing consoles, and I was also working with a lot of people that didn't. So I started to find out that a lot more of the clients that I was getting on a daily basis was more people that were coming from like a small M box with not much equipment, but amazing, talented individuals. I've worked with so many amazing individuals. Don't let your creativity be dictated by your sound quality. It's not that. That's why you hire in a mastering engineer. So the thing is a lot of the mixes I was getting were really not, they weren't capable of competing with some of the professional records we were working on, just due to the fact that they weren't hitting the line amps and the gain stages and so forth. So the number one thing that I wanted to solve in the studio was to get a few pairs of line amplifiers, as like you would do when you return it back on a mixing board. As I started helping people in my area build studios and remembering back to the recording workshop that I worked and just understood signal flow, why does the analog studio sound different than the digital studio, and so forth. And I started to remember that the line amplifier feeds back from the tape machine, and then we can change the gain of the line amp, and that was a lot of the sound as it hits that, and then it hits the summing module. The other thing it does is it hits like an insert module. So the first stage of the studio that I work out of to get the most for the people that work with me is I have a pair of Neve 1073s. Now they're the lunchbox version, and I want you to know I actually prefer them. A gentleman that I work with, and you'll see his studio in upcoming videos, he has the original 1073s, like with the EQ, racked. I mean, that's hard to get. Those are really expensive. Those have this sound that are just, it's insane. The 1073s from the 500 series, a little bit newer, same thing. It's from the Neve company. When you get the box, it says real Neve, you know, so it's really cool. Really great and big fan of the other companies that are pretty much, I say, paying respect to, in a sense, and you guys can judge that for yourself. But a lot of companies that have done a lot of great things, and the Neve 1073 is an iconic sound. With that being said, that is our line amp. So once your song is in Pro Tools, it's going to hit that line amplifier, and we're going to drive that as much as we can to get the gain stage correct. The other two that we have are another pair of Neves, which are Porticos, which are a lot cleaner, but these have a thing called the Silk. So the Silk can impart that 1073, but it can also impart like a 12, I think it's a 1272, or more of a low end, like room filling sound, which you can only get with that kind of hardware. I think you can do it with harmonics. You can do things in the box with plugins nowadays, but there's something to be said about having the proper gain stage. So that's the first stage. So it goes out of the converter, and I'll talk about the converter last, but it goes out of that converter. It feeds the line amp on the 1073, or we can switch and it feeds the line amp on the Portico. Now, if we don't need any of that and it was well recorded, we bypass that whole process, and then we're gonna master it. So in our stems, or if we're doing a mix, we'll do one by one. I'll actually print them, because nowadays that's what people want. Or if the mix is really big, I have 2 studios around this area that I'll work out of, and then I'll bring it back here for a final if I have to. So once it goes out of the 1073s, it's going to feed an actual summing channel on an SSL. So in our rack here, all this has been thought out. So we have an X rack, and the X rack has 2 16-channel summing. Now I don't want to use its line, I just want to use its summing. So what it's going to do is I push that 1073 into that summing. You're going to get that natural sound of the image starting to take shape, and it has this thing. There's everybody will tell you that when you drive an SSL, there's this stereo field thing that happens that you can't really describe. It's like, wow, it sounds larger than the speakers. It's incredible. So the harder I hit that, and the harder I hit that summing module, the bigger it gets. It's incredible. So that's even before we start EQing and compressing and doing all that stuff. So now we have over here on the left, and I know it's probably hard to see, and I apologize, I just want to give you the rundown, but we'll go into an Ssl EQ. So this is like returning to a board. That's really what my X-Rack is. It's an Ssl EQ, Ssl Dynamic. A lot of times I don't use the Dynamic, but this is one that SSL was proud of. I have a stereo version of that, so it's matched to a T right and left. You don't have to worry about, you know, it getting out of phase or changing it. So I thought that was one of the most unique things I've ever seen. And a lot of the music I do, hip hop, pop, rock, EDM, it doesn't matter. Anything besides like classical and jazz, I'm going to impart that SSL. There's something to be said about the Ssl EQ. You can drive it hard. You can push it. If you've watched Chris Lord Algae, that's the boards that he's using. And there's something to be said about this. So we impart that sound. So now you're getting a 1073 front end, and then you're getting an SSL. Now, if you watch, there was a video on Michael Brower talking about the J series. He said he used to use the 1073s or a Neve, just a Neve box. I think there was a certain model, so I'm not going to quote that. But then he would hit the Ssl E series or the G series, and he was missing something. There was an actual SSL board that came out, which is the J series, which became popular in the 90s. So in a sense, that's what I'm doing to get that big, round, focused sound of what people would classify the J series. I'm getting that with the Neve 1073s. I love how it sounds, and then when it hits that summing and then it hits that EQ, there's nothing better. I promise you. It's just like, holy smokes. So once we do that, now we have the EQ section on the Portico. It comes back into, so I can do some refining, and there's a de-esser on the Portico. the louder it goes, these shrill frequencies are coming out. I bought the Portico strictly because I love the sound of the Portico stuff. I love their master bus processor. I love it. The de-esser on this thing is insane. I mean, it's the cleanest, clearest, most accurate de-esser I've ever heard. It's literally so unnoticeable that it's the most perfect thing I've ever heard for mastering, if that's even a word. Like, when you have shrillness, you just set it to that frequency, it'll take it and it'll calm it down, it'll push it back, and you can really push it back. But as the louder we go, the more shrill comes out, the more it pushes it back, pushes it back, pushes it back. So that's a really cool tool. And then we have just a 4-band EQ. We have another stage of compression on here that they're linked. So this is stereo left and right once again. So we link these two, and we can pick and choose what we want to do. We can just barely hit it. We can use a short attack, long release to just grab and control. And we have multiple compressors in the chain that it's still going to hit. So it goes out of these. And what it's going to do now is it's going to feed, either bypass the Manley or it's going to impart the Manley. The reason I purchased this Manley, number one, I do a lot of sessions with vocals. So I'll use that as a vocal compressor, like a mastering compressor for vocals. There's nothing better than an LA2A, and it's a clean LA2A. And also the way that this is called the ELOP Plus. They specifically designed this, and they gave it a little bit more versatility. Is that a word? They allow it, and it sounded so incredible on the bus. And one of my good friends has the Vox boxes. I've had the Very Mew. I've had the Massive Passive, and I was just blown away with the sound that this had. That Manley sound. There's this, just, you cannot put your finger on it. It just has that sound. It's the tubes, and the Manley company has always been just one of those companies that I really, really enjoy the sound of their gear. So we'll hit that if we have to. So if it still needs warmed up just a little bit, we can add that warmth. If not, we'll bypass it. I'm not using it to totally change the dynamics. If that was the case, I would probably use like the New Mew or the Very Mew or do something like that. But I really like what it does, just to give a little more low-mid image, and it just works well in my chain. It's all about the chain. It really is. So once it leaves there, so I'll pick and choose. Do I want to compress it? Do I want to limit it a little bit? And then I'll just make the decision. After that happens, it finally hits my Portico master bus. So the master bus is where one of the most used pieces of equipment I've ever purchased. It has a side chain, and I did a video on this, and I want you guys to check that out. So this video, I give you all the options. So that's my final stage, and I can really carve and make decisions, and you can put a lot of limiting on, and you can't even hear it. You can use the compressor, and it'll just slam that down. It is one of the cleanest, clearest, most precise compressors. It's one of those things, if you don't know about compression and you don't understand what you're listening for, and you're not feeding it the correct gain stage, you might think, oh man, I can't even hear this thing. Like, this thing's crazy. But as you start to understand this box, I think more than ever, it's the most precise sounding piece of equipment I've ever used, and I love it. And I don't think I would ever see myself using something else for this purpose. There's some sort of magic it does when you do different EQs with the stereo field. It also has the silk knob, so you can do a combo with this setup. But yeah, it is a great way to get it to that final level. It can drive things past the point of oblivion without changing them, which is incredible. And it's a lot better at bringing something super loud and keeping and retaining the bass image that everybody wants. They want it loud and big bass, especially hip hop, EDM, and all those pop. So that is the chain. So once it goes there, it sends it back to the next piece, which is from Antelope Audio. So I want to do a full video on the converters. I'm going to end this video with this, but I want to do a second video to talk about just the conversion, because that is a big part of my sound. The Antelope company came out with this new converter called the Antelope Amari, and it is mind-blowing. And I think I want to give it its own video, because I had that question come up as well on the channel. So that is my chain. It literally is line amps, two to choose from, summing into the mix. The mix knob on the master module allows me to adjust the sound before it hits the mastering. Then the mastering happens. Oh, and the last but not least, so once it hits this is a trick I'm going to tell you. This is the Mog EQ, and that one I'm going to do a video on as well. So the Mog EQ is my final. It's the magic. It's a little bit of that magic. Let's just put it this way. The Mog EQ is the only EQ that can really something to be said about the sub band in the way that Mog, the designer, set those bands. They called it the 3D EQ, and it brings this holographic sound. And a gentleman that I was introduced to, he's been doing a lot of things with movie and film, and he's like, dude, you gotta check that out. It's incredible. I checked it out, and I learned from some great engineers that I put it last in my chain, and I can just do that final tuck and final push and final spread, and you get your master back, and it sounds larger than life. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next video, and the Antelope Amari, and some of the other stuff I got. So my name's Doug Jenkins. That is my signal flow in the mastering studio as well as the mixing studio. I don't do a lot of tracking. It's set up for mixing, set up for mastering. But if you're at home and you do decent tracking, and you can do a decent mix, we do a lot of this work for people. So hopefully we get to hear from you sometime in the future, and everybody stay safe out there. So my name's Doug Jenkins. I mix nmaster.com, just the letter N, master.com. And if you ever send me something, I'd be glad to work on it, because that's what we do this for. So everybody stay safe. That's my mastering rack. It's pretty cool. And it is hot in here. I'm probably sweating. Insane. We got to get the AC fixed.